If I asked you the name of the countries that defeated the Axis powers in World War II, what would you say? Britain, America, the Soviet Union, Canada perhaps? India probably wouldn't even cross your mind. And that's remarkable because more than 2.5 million Indians served during that war. They fought the Germans and Italians in Africa, they fought in Italy, they served across the Middle East. And when the Japanese army came through Burma towards India, Indian soldiers were right there in some of the hardest fighting of the Asian War. Around 87,000 Indian servicemen died, and these are not obscure numbers someone discovered recently. They are part of the historical record. So why does India feel almost absent from the popular story of the World War II? That's where things get interesting. I am Raman, and this is Chakra View Global. In 1939, India wasn't a sovereign country. It was part of the British Empire. So when Britain declared war on Germany, the Viceroy of India simply declared India at war as well. There was no independent Indian government making that decision. In fact, Indian political leaders were not even properly consulted. And yet, over the next 6 years, the Indian army expanded enormously. More than 2.5 million men served. It became one of the largest volunteer forces the world had ever seen. And these men were not just defending Indian territory. Indian divisions were deployed across an extraordinary stretch of the world. North and East Africa, Iraq and Iran, Italy, Southeast Asia, and then in 1944, the war arrived at India's doorstep. Japan had already swept through much of Southeast Asia and occupied Burma. Japanese forces pushed towards Northeast India. That brought them to two places most people outside India have probably never even heard of: Imphal and Kohima. The Japanese offensive was stopped there, and after that, the momentum began to reverse. Allied forces pushed back into Burma, and Indian troops formed a major part of that campaign. Britain's own National Army Museum credits the Indian Army with a leading role in the defeat of Japanese forces in Burma. That's worth remembering when you hear the phrase, "the British fought the Japanese in Burma." Well, they did, but British in the context of the British Empire does not necessarily mean that the soldier carrying the rifle was from Britain. In fact, very often he wasn't. He was Indian. And this is where India's World War II story becomes much more complicated. Britain presented the war as a struggle against tyranny. For many Indians, there was an obvious response: then why are we still a colony? In 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement. The British authorities arrested Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and much of the Congress leadership. So while Indian soldiers were fighting Axis powers overseas, India's independence movement was confronting British rule at home. Subhas Chandra Bose went even further. He believed Britain would never willingly give India freedom. His Indian National Army fought alongside Japan against the British and Allied forces. Now this all created that extraordinary situation of Indians fighting on opposite sides of the same war for completely different ideas of how India would eventually become free. And somehow, things were about to get even darker. In 1943, Bengal descended into a famine. Roughly 2 to 3 million people died. There is a serious historical debate about exactly how responsibility for the famine should be divided. The Japanese occupation of Burma had disrupted rice supplies. There was wartime inflation, there were crop and distribution problems. But British colonial policies, wartime priorities, and the response to the famine have also been heavily criticized by historians. And the British Prime Minister at that time was Winston Churchill. This is where British and Indian memories of the same man can look very different. In Britain, Churchill is remembered primarily as a leader who refused to surrender to Hitler. Well, that part of his legacy is real. But Churchill was also deeply hostile to Indian nationalism. His contempt for Gandhi was hardly hidden. He once described Gandhi as a seditious Middle Temple lawyer posing as a fakir and complained about him approaching the representative of the British Crown half naked to negotiate on equal terms. That last part is very important. On equal terms. Because it exposes the strange hierarchy underneath the entire relationship. An Indian could put on a British uniform, travel thousands of kilometers, fight Germany, Italy or Japan, and die defending the British Empire. But the idea of an Indian political leader negotiating with that empire as an equal? Churchill found that deeply offensive. Meanwhile, Bengal was experiencing catastrophe. And India was still supplying the wider Allied war effort with soldiers, money, materials, and infrastructure, and most important of them all, food. It's very difficult to imagine a sharper contradiction. So the question is, how did all of this become so obscure? Part of the answer is actually quite simple. After the war, countries remembered World War II through their own national experiences. Britain had the Blitz, Churchill, and the Battle of Britain. America had Pearl Harbor, Normandy, and the Pacific. The Soviet Union had Moscow, Stalingrad, and Berlin. India, on the other hand, did not enter the war as an independent nation. It entered as a part of an empire. So much of what Indian soldiers accomplished became absorbed into the history of the British forces. That's technically understandable, but it changes how later generations imagine the war. A young person hears British forces in Burma and probably pictures soldiers from Britain. They don't picture hundreds and thousands of men from the Indian subcontinent fighting that war. And slowly, the distinction between Britain and the British Empire disappears, and so does much of India's contribution. None of this means Britain or America did not make enormous sacrifices. Well, they did. Nor should we minimize the almost unimaginable Soviet losses in the Eastern Front or China's long war against Japan. The point is almost the opposite. World War II was genuinely a world war. Its victory belonged to far more people than the handful of countries that dominate movies, documentaries, and popular culture today. India was one of them. More than 2.5 million servicemen, around 87,000 dead. From the deserts of Africa to the mountains of Italy and the jungles of Burma. And they did all of that while their own country was still fighting for the right to govern itself. And then became the final irony. The war ended in 1945, Britain emerged victorious, and just 2 years later, India was independent. The empire that millions of Indians had just helped defend was beginning to disappear. So perhaps the real question is not why India does not get enough credit for the World War II. It's something much bigger. How different would our understanding of history be if we told the story from the perspective of the people who fought it, rather than only the countries that eventually wrote it? I am Raman, and you are listening to the Chakra View Global. I will see you in the next episode soon. Until then, Jai Hind.